Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we take cultural issues and we tackle them with biblical truth. I have a guest on the show today that I think you're going to really enjoy our conversation. And I personally know Janell because we met at CIA last summer. It was my second CIA in a row. And I love going to CIA and meeting the people there that you don't hear their names all over, like the apologetic scene, because I just think it's so cool and respectful and admirable and all of these things when you have people who are just telling others about the Lord, or they have their podcast that maybe not a lot of people know about, because I can relate to that. That's me. And to see what they're doing and how they're impacting their own communities and their own worlds for the Lord. And I love that. And Janell's one of those people that I met at CIA. And so I'm excited to bring her on. But before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about her. She loves to have honest, imperfect conversations about faith in Jesus Christ. She has a master's degree in counseling psychology and a background in advocacy and ministry. She is a writer, speaker, high school foreign exchange coordinator, and host of the Finding Something Real podcast, a grace-filled journey for young women who have faith questions or objections. She lives in Eastern Washington with her husband, the kindest man she knows, 4 kids, and often a teenage exchange daughter. In her free time, she can be found watching vintage television with her family and avoiding the kitchen. Janell, I'm glad that you're here. I have 2 questions. I want to know what
Shannon,
vintage
thank you.
TV is.
What was that?
What's vintage TV? Like, what
Oh
is?
my gosh. Like the Dick Van Dyke Show, Mary Tyler Moore,
Oh,
I Love Lucy,
Brady Bunch.
Columbo. Those are all good.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, I love that. Yeah, I remember the summers like growing up, and there were reruns of, I don't know what channel it was, but on this specific channel in the mornings till like almost till noon, I think it was. Me and my brother and sister would get up and it'd be like the Brady Bunch, the
Mm,
monkeys, I think, like hey, we're the monkeys. Um, I don't know, I don't remember what other shows. I think Andy Griffith's show.
yeah.
Our little schedule, and at noon we'd have to clean up the house and do our chores. And so we would watch those shows. So I totally know. I think I said the other day in a Zoom with my students, I said, "Oh, we got a big Brady Bunch line going here." And I'm like, they may not even know what the Brady Bunch is. Like,
Yeah.
I know what the Brady Bunch is, but anyways, that's
I
cool. I
know.
love it. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
welcome to Her Faith Inspires.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Shanda. I'm really excited to be here. And it was so fun meeting you at CIA too. I just remember how warm and inviting you were right when I first met you. We were sitting in that back row and you're like, hey, you've got a podcast too. And it was just a great conversation from the start. So I really appreciate you and what you're doing here.
Thanks. I'm glad you feel that way. Well, I'm intrigued about your podcast. I mean, we talked about it when we were at CIA and things like that, but I want to get into the meat of it. I mean, you've had Frank Turek, you've had Jay Warner Wallace. I don't know who else you've had on your podcast, but they come on your podcast. But your podcast is unique.
Mhm.
And when you told, actually, I was thinking about this as we were talking about doing this podcast. I was like, it would be really difficult. I mean, you can explain it better, and I want you to, but you're getting these younger girls with questions about Christianity, like the bigger questions, and then you're finding someone to come on and answer them. Am I wrong? Like, can you explain that? That's
No, that's pretty
coordinate.
much it.
That would be so tough to coordinate. I feel like.
Well, yeah, you're the first person I think that's ever like, I mean, people can acknowledge that have had podcasts before, but yeah, it is a bit of a challenge and it took a while to figure that out. You know, when I started my podcast, I just wanted to reach out to young women who had questions and weren't sure about faith, especially my exchange daughter who didn't believe in God, or wasn't sure whether she believed in God. And I found that they weren't really listening to my podcast, Shanda. You know, I mean, it's really hard to get somebody who's not interested or who's not sure that they're uncomfortable with their ambivalence to listen. And what happened was in March of 2020, the whole world, you know, shut down. I had started my podcast in September of 2019. And our exchange daughter, who was living with us at the time, was from Italy, and she's agnostic. She grew up Catholic in a Catholic culture, but her family wasn't really religious, even though she worked at a church, that kind of thing. Lots of questions, very sensitive, very sweet young woman. And she was heartbroken that she needed to go back home, which you may remember at the beginning of the pandemic, Italy was one of the hardest hit places. And she was going right in there. I mean, it was tons of fear and it was really scary. And what was interesting was at the time I was doing a series on my podcast about Clarity 2020, super original. And I was doing a series on clarity in the gospel because it was April, Easter. I was, doing a whole theme. And I invited my exchange daughter, who was 17, I believe 17 at the time. I said, "Would you come and sit in on this conversation with me?" And she said, "Sure." She was broken, she was hurting. And so we sat down, excuse me. And at that point, she had lived with us for quite a few months. She knew that our faith was important. We had had private conversations about God. She had been going to, different youth functions and different things like that, and going to church with us sometimes. And she came, and I thought, this is the most beautiful thing I think I could ever do with my podcast, is bring somebody to hear the gospel message. And I want to do this with my life. And what happened was that whole month when I had those conversations with different guests, because my podcast is weekly, I invited young women who weren't sure about God to join me for those conversations. And there was a fire that was lit in me. I was like, this is what I want to do. So I went back to one of those young women a couple months later. She's from Germany. I call her my exchange niece. She's an atheist and beautiful young woman. Love her so much, Tati. And I said, "Tati, I want to do this. I want to have girls like you on my podcast." Um, and she said, "I don't want to come back on your podcast, Janell." And I said, "Well, why not?" She's like, "Well, to be honest, I wasn't prepared," because she had spoken to a really well-prepared apologist. And she goes, "It just kind of made me uncomfortable. I'm not really that interested." And I, kept after her a little bit. And she finally got back to me and she's like, "I don't want anything to do with Jesus. I never will," that kind of thing. But what I realized in what Tati shared with me, there's this great quote that I love to share with people. It's by David Augsburger. And he says, "Being heard is so close to being loved that to the average person, it's basically indistinguishable."
Mm.
And I had Justin Brierley from the Unbelievable podcast on my podcast. And I asked him, because for someone not familiar with what Justin Brierley does, he invites skeptics and Christians on his podcast, and he lets the chips fall where they may. And I asked him, I said, "That's a big risk. You're having people on that are going to, what if people are led astray? They hear this new idea and all these different things." And he said, I don't take my contribution, and he didn't say it quite like this, so I'm totally paraphrasing. I'll have to go back. But basically, he's like, "I don't take myself that seriously. That's the real life. That's the real world. People are going to be confronted with different ideas. I give people the option to hear it. And I prepare Christians." He goes, "In the beginning, he got pushback from Christians. Like, we have that on the BBC. Why do we need it here on a Christian programming?" Um, but he creates a place where people can have conversations like that. And so when I started inviting young women on my podcast, what I officially, in January of 2021, what I did was, the very first episode of the month is just me and that young woman having a conversation. And that conversation involves no pushback from me. I let her share her story, her questions, her objections, even the things she thinks are ridiculous about faith. I very rarely give any input from a Christian perspective on that. I just listen, more like I'm not doing counseling, but more just walking them through a process. And then they've already signed up. They know exactly what's coming. We agree that there will be Christian guests coming on to address those questions. And then we invite them. And the girls sometimes come back, sometimes they don't. But it's an invitation for them. I like to think of it, the whole month is like a love letter to that one girl who's got those questions. And that one girl represents a ton of other girls who may be listening secretly, who may have a loved one listening, who maybe points their loved one to that. Because I think the only way my podcast works is by invitation, or it's a Christian parent, someone who, or a teacher, somebody who loves young people, who goes, wait a second, these are the questions young people are asking, and this is the way that you can address it. So yeah, it's my favorite thing. I love it. And that's a long answer to your question.
Oh, so you started in September of 2019, because my podcast began in December of 2019. And I think it's funny because you might have your own idea of how it's going to go, but it's the same thing with worldview development. People stay stuck in this belief system until something tragic hits their life, or they come to this moment of evaluating, wait a second, is this really the path I'm going to go down? I mean, that's how people begin to question what they believe. And usually after the age of 30, it's the only way a worldview they'll question the worldview or even dig into other belief systems. Now, that's way different than a podcast. But what I'm saying is something like COVID could make you even check, wait, why am I doing this? Like, why did I start this podcast? Is this the route I'm going to take? Or am I going to travel down that path where it's, yeah, we're going to take on these controversial topics or whatever, which is kind of what I like to do because the culture is facing these controversial issues, right?
Mhm.
So my podcast did take a turn with COVID. You said yours did.
Yeah.
What did you first start off with?
Oh, in the beginning, it was just me inviting guests on to have conversations. I had this whole series on ish, identity, and impetus, about the stuff that gets in the way of us coming to Jesus, who we are when we embrace our identity in Christ, and the force that moves us into the world to love on others. And then I thought, wow, I love this, but I can't do it on my own. I need help. God provided an amazing young woman at Liberty University to come along and help me. She's my podcast producer. She does all the, like, she makes sure that I'm on schedule every week. So that was amazing. But then, I thought I would just do like Christian topics, but still try to reach that girl who had these questions. And what I realized when I did that, those episodes about the gospel, I realized I don't want to talk about anything else.
Mm,
I don't want to talk about anything else except for the saving work of Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean we don't talk about other things,
right.
but almost in every episode, someone is giving an invitation to the gospel message. And
Mm,
that is so important to me because that is where everything starts. We don't front load the gospel. Life change doesn't come first, it comes with an encounter with Jesus. And so I love to meet these girls where they're at. And it's taken, like you said, it takes a while to figure out, okay, how does this all work? And my podcast journey has been through quite a few evolutions, right? Just figuring out, okay, how do I bring this girl to the table? How do I love on her intentionally? Without expectation of how it's going to turn out. Even if she doesn't show up, which that part lately has been the hardest part, is when she doesn't show up for people like Jay Warner Wallace. When Jim came on, that episode is going to air in May, hopefully. He's like, hey, can you get a hold of her? And I'm trying. I couldn't get her to come,
yeah,
and that's not my responsibility.
yeah.
But to be obedient and just say, okay, God, you gave me a burden for these young women, and I want to be obedient with what you've given me, and let the chips fall where they may. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you do with when somebody doesn't show up? What do you do when you have Jim sitting there?
I've got their questions because I've already talked with them.
Awesome.
And I
Okay.
already know. So then I'm advocating for them. I'm doing what I used to do for a career. I'm doing in the podcast, and I'm playing that girl's advocate. I'm asking the hard questions of the Christian, knowing where they're probably going to go, and also knowing that there's good answers from the Christian worldview for these questions that the young woman has brought up.
That is awesome. That's awesome. That's okay. All right. So obviously I can hear your heart. I mean, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, is Janelle going to start crying? Because if she starts crying, I start crying. Yeah, because I mean, you have a passion for these girls. And it's really interesting because I guess you have an open door too through being an exchange coordinator. Like you have the girls in Germany and Italy, which is so fascinating to me. But how often now is that how you have access to their questions and the struggle of, because this is Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
Z is, I mean, we're Gen Z's going through it. And
Yeah.
those are all my boys, Gen Z. Um, how often are you encountering this, or is it you're encountering it often because of the position that you have?
Yeah, great question. And yes, I am encountering it often because of the position that I have. But I have the position that I have because I intentionally wanted to talk about my faith with young women that I care about. Relationship grants us access, right? So, as an exchange coordinator for a secular organization, which came after hosting, we had decided to host, and that was a whole God thing. But I get to invest in young people's lives. Usually, they're over here between the ages of 16 and 18, and European and to some extent, the Asian young people that come over here, they have a different level of maturity than some of the young people that I encounter here. And that's not, a dig at Gen Z, but it's just they seem a little older because they've been given different privileges that we don't necessarily give our children here in America, especially the European students that I work with. So they come over here and I get to love on them. That's part of my job, is just to have a relationship with them and make sure that they're supported throughout their exchange year. But then eventually, as you know, Shanda, when you love something like Jesus, it's not very long before the thing that you love starts to spill out of you just in natural ways. It's
Yeah.
not something that you have to force, it's just something that comes out.
Mhm.
And most of the girls that I encounter, they've never really met anybody who truly believed in the Lord.
Mhm.
And that is heartbreaking to me.
Mhm.
When we decide to host, because thousands of young people come over here every year, it's an amazing opportunity for any family to host a student. Um, I remember looking up statistics about the Netherlands because our first daughter was from the Netherlands, and it's one of the most unchurched, most secular countries in the Western world.
Mhm.
And I just thought, oh my gosh, young people that are growing up in today's Western culture are thinking that Jesus is on par with the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. They've never met any one of their peers who actually believe this stuff. And then they come over here and they're shocked by it. And my heart, yeah, it did break about over that. I think something I learned from a very young age is if you pray for God to use you, you pray for a burden, you pray to be sold out for Him, guess what? He answers that prayer.
Mhm.
And that's what's happened to me. And it's very imperfect. That's why I put that in my bio. It's messy. Last night, I lost it upstairs with all my kids. I got 4 kids. I got an exchange daughter. I was mad at my husband. It all comes spewing out. I'm like, okay, Lord, thank you for the reminder that it's by your grace and not our works, right? It's grace. And anyway, yeah. So I love hosting, and I love getting to know these young people from different cultures and not ever being I'm no longer shocked by our culture because Europe, they're further along than we are in the secular realm.
Mhm.
And so I get to see it, maybe get a little preview of what's to come here.
So do they feel like America itself is a Christian nation when they come here? Are they like, "Oh my gosh, you guys are so into God?"
Yeah, there's some of that for sure. They learn because they're prepared before they come about, a lot of people here are religious and they go to church regularly. I remember the girl that I shared, she's the only one whose name I've actually dropped, Tati,
Mhm.
atheist from Germany. So funny. She's like, I've never met anyone like you, Janelle. And she even shared that on the podcast. And like praying in the morning, doing all this stuff. It's so foreign. But she's not the only one. I've had that conversation again and again. It's just, wow, you actually believe this. And what's interesting, Shanda, is that a lot of them are being raised in a culture where maybe they go to a Christian school or a religious school over there. They have some experience with religion, but it's not something that they actually believe. It's just something they're learning as, a bunch of stories
Wow.
that make people feel good.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So what is the outcome? Like, what are you experiencing after you've had some of the girls on the podcast and you're going over their questions with them? and you have people on to help answer them and walk them through it, do you hear from them later? Do they ever say, this is getting, like, okay, I want to give my life to Jesus? Do you get different, I mean, I'm sure maybe different responses. Do you get complete hostility where it's like, no, still don't believe it?
Yeah, it's a mixture for
Yeah.
sure. I try, uh, when we first started hosting, I was like, she's going to get saved. I had a bunch of ladies over to pray over her room. I'm thinking, she's got no chance. She's going to be living for a year with a Christian family who really loves her, who's on mission. And I recognized over the years, hopefully as I mature, that the outcome is always up to God. And so while I love my favorite episodes are always the ones where a young woman is genuinely searching for truth and love in Jesus. And I have had that happen, but I also have seen the emotional objection rise because sometimes all these intellectual objections people have are really just hiding an emotional barrier, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to give my life to him. I'm afraid of what he'll do with that.
Mhm.
And I've definitely seen that come up a couple times. I've had moments where I've thought, oh my gosh, someone's going to get saved today, and that hasn't so far happened. But I also have had people like the girl that I mentioned, Tati, who showed up for the first initial conversation, never came back for a subsequent episode. Those episodes, I love. Some of them were my favorite episodes I've ever recorded. And I had other girls standing in her stead, other girls who didn't believe in God. I was like, hey, come on, I've got, this guy over here. He's really well known over here. They don't care. First
Yeah.
of all, they don't care who I get on the podcast.
Sure.
I just want to find people who are equipped. And it
Right.
helps to find people who are doing this a lot, who are really good at what they do. Um, but yeah, a lot of times it's just, you've helped me overcome some objections, but I still don't want to believe. Or, if it's a Christian girl, it's still apathy, or it's perceived apathy, or I'm just not sure. And sometimes, it's a continued relationship. So especially if it's one of the girls in my exchange family, I'm still investing in them even after the podcast is over. We still have a relationship, especially if they're a close person. The other day, I had a girl reach out to me who's a Christian who just had some questions, and she's like, "Hey, Janelle, would you, jump on a call with me and talk with me about some things? I just thought of you. I'm dealing with this issue in my life. It was anxiety." And so, anyway, those things I love, but sometimes I never hear from somebody I talk with either. So,
Mhm.
what I love about podcasting, though, and this,
Mhm.
it's out there. It's
Yes.
out there for a long time, and they
Yep.
can always go back. They can always
And
go back.
sometimes I think it's not only about the person that you're speaking to, it's about the others who hear the conversation.
Right.
And so you might get people who have those same questions, but you are answering that one girl on your podcast. Yet there's other girls in the audience or other people in the audience who are saying, "Oh my gosh, that answered it for me." I mean, we just won't always know the effect that our ministry has or our words have on other people. That's why we can't say, "Oh, this is for nothing." That's why Paul says, "Don't grow weary in doing good," because after, in due season, you will reap a harvest. And so
Galatians 6:9. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And sometimes we have to remember that, like, in that same book, Galatians, he's talking about, reaping what you sow, and you can either sow to the spirit or sow to the flesh. Every time you're having these spiritual conversations and you're doing that groundwork that I think Greg Kokel even talks about, like
Mhm.
you're gardening, you're tending to that soil. A lot of people want to plant the flowers, but you have to do the groundwork first. You have to prepare that groundwork. It's the planting and the watering. I mean, that all that planting language used in
Mhm.
through Paul is what we have to remember, because sometimes when seeds, or not sometimes, in the natural way that the cycle is, it has God has designed it, is you put the seed in the ground and we don't see when the roots take place.
Mhm.
We don't see the growth under the dirt. We
Yeah.
only know that we have to be the faithful gardeners and go and water and tend to it when and however we can. And so that's what I love too about conversations on social media. If we snap back at somebody, but other people are looking at our conversations, um, that's not going to bode well for the person who asked the question or for the people who are reading our
Right.
answers, and how we answer them. So a lot of times it's the audience too.
Hmm.
And you're right, that episode will always be there, and they can go back and be like, what was that again? Because I truly believe that when people lay their heads on their pillows and it's the quiet and the stillness of the nighttime, when you really, it's just you and your thoughts, that's when you are the most tormented by the truth, if
Yeah.
you're trying to run from it. And
Yeah.
those are when I say the truth will haunt people, and they really truly reflect on, like, sometimes I'll think about stuff like my kids getting older, or the way that I acted, or the way I responded. And then I'll get up in the morning and be like, oh, I feel better now. It's the morning. We got another day. But in the nighttime, it's like, was I good enough, mom? Like, did I, you know what I mean? Like, you mull over the events and the things and the conversation.
Yes.
So
It
that's
was
the encouragement.
It was funny because I invite girls at the end of the month to always join me again for a one-on-one conversation because it's a little less intimidating. And sometimes they join me, sometimes they don't. Those episodes go out as Patreon episodes. But and often it's really interesting hearing how they've been affected by the conversations, especially if they've shown up. But one of the girls, my German exchange daughter, not Tati, a different German, she was so funny because she talked with Frank Turek and some of these other guys, and she's like, my position that God is not real, it's not as strong anymore.
Mm,
Like this kind of thing. So yeah, you're right. We don't get to see a lot of the outcome, right?
yeah,
But we know that God's promises, is do not grow weary in doing good.
sure.
And we may not get to see that harvest the way we want to see it here on earth, but
Right.
God is up to good things, and we get to be part of that process.
He's always working. We can't think that God is ever complacent, because he's not. I mean, even Romans 8:28, God works all things together for good. So he's working those things in our lives. He's making sure that they are producing something good to those that love him. But you know, one of the things I think about is that Gen Z is struggling so much. We see that decline in America, that of this belief in God and going to church. And even after COVID, it affected that attendance rate of the church. Oh my gosh, so much. And for you to say, like, they're saying, oh, God, the Easter bunny, what's the difference? Basically, I think that this is a generational issue that we're seeing. And I wanted to bring that up because I feel like you're in the middle of all of these questions, and these are Gen Z. They may be Gen Z from another country, but they're still Gen Z that you're having these conversations with. And it doesn't sound much different than the kids in our country at their same age, right? So why do you think that, looking at the Gen Z in our country, why do you think this is happening? Why do you think these Christians are becoming less, or I wouldn't say Christians, these kids who are in a Christian church or in a Christian home are kind of coming up with the same conclusion as the girls that are coming from other countries?
Mm. Well, I think that's a good question, but I think a lot of it has to do with looking at ourselves, and going, okay, if I want to see passionate, excited, engaged young people, am I modeling that for
Mhm.
them? And so often I think it's really easy, and I do this too, where it's kind of like I'm going to shake my finger a little bit and be like, man, that Gen Z, they're really screwed up. Like they're believing a lot of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, what they want, if statistics and research is correct, they want belonging, they want meaning, they want to be heard, they want to be loved. And so where are they finding that? They're finding that in the relationships that they have with people, their friends, their peers who are, having identity crises and feeling like they can be whoever they want, depending on whatever day it is. Maybe they're watching TikToks and getting their theology from a 1-minute video, and suddenly it's undermined.
Yeah.
Maybe, their parents aren't really talking to them about faith, or maybe they're afraid to ask questions because when they do talk about faith, they're so sure of the answers that they feel like there's no room for doubt. I think that a lot of that is just us going, okay, how do we equip young people with places of, a safe place to ask questions, a place where they're loved unconditionally, where our love is not conditional on whether or not they believe like we do. And I think that's hard sometimes. The other day I was dropping off my kids for school, for middle school and high school, same building. And there were a bunch of people out there, and they were from the GSA club, the Gay Straight Alliance Club, and they were there to love on people.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking that needs to be the church,
Mhm.
right? And often it is. I mean, I don't want to, I don't want to critique God's bride, right?
Right,
I mean, maybe a little bit, but I don't want to poo-poo it, right? Because God
right.
loves his bride. And we're all, sinners saved by grace. But we need to love these young people, not just point our fingers and say, this is what you're doing wrong. I that comes from relationship. The point of being able to say, hey, I'm concerned about these ideas that you've got. I'm concerned about where you're headed.
Yeah.
I worked with a student last year who, has issues with his identity. And he's just like, Janelle, this is why I don't like Christians, blah, blah, blah. He calls me multiple times
Mhm.
every week, because he knows I care about him no matter what, even if my ideas are different than his, even if I'm a Bible believing Christian and he finds the gospel offensive. But I hope that that's what he finds offensive, and not the way that I approach him, the way that I care about him. And I think that it starts with, how can we love people? And I also think too, just to piggyback on that, the church cannot be insular. It cannot be focused on itself, like we're around holding hands in a circle, singing worship songs and talking about how bad the world is. No, the church is meant to be pointed outward, preparing and equipping and sending people out. The
Mhm.
other day, before we pressed record, you mentioned what happened in Tennessee with the shooting there. Heartbreaking.
Mhm.
And I remember, just a couple of days ago, watching the video of those armed forces going in, the policemen who were prepared. They were prepared, they'd been equipped, they had trained, they were there within minutes, and they went on a mission to look for those children that were under enemy attack, right? That is what we're called to do as Christians. We need to be prepared, because one day we're going to get those crisis calls. We're going to have somebody call us and say, hey, these lies of the world, they've fallen in on me, and now what do I do? Guess what? I'm going in. I'm going in to help someone that's made in God's image and save them from the enemy who is holding them hostage. And that's what we're equipped to do as believers. And I think we need to pray for the next generation. We need to meet them where they're at, and we need to be equipped. Apologetics is a great way to do that, because eventually those TikTok videos, those other things, I was talking to Mr. B the other day with Red Pen Logic, it's amazing how much they're stirring up questions. We need to be prepared that people are going to be asking questions, and not be surprised or upset when they come our way.
Absolutely. I think you said a word, apathetic, and you're seeing these, for one, the younger generation, through either the exchange students or even some of our own Gen Z in our own country, being apathetic toward what they believe, like, if God exists. And that is a true statistic. George Barna even gives the statistic that do you believe in God? Yes, no, who cares? Who cares is part of the stats now, and that's a scary thought for people who don't care about and about what they believe, because they don't truly understand that what they believe drives how they live. And if there is an eternity and there is a God, then that is worth finding out the answer to. But I also believe apathy, we can be like, oh my gosh, like you said, we can be so easy to shake the finger and say, gosh, you don't even care about what you believe. But I believe that people who call themselves Christians, are we being apathetic toward those whose souls are hanging in the balance, or who don't care? And are we igniting a passion, showing them that, gosh, you can be passionate about something in the world today in a loving way that wants other people to say, I have the good news for you. Like, you may be hurting, you may be struggling with identity, you may not know what purpose is, because God provides all of those things. But I want to tell you why God is worth believing in and why he's worth putting your faith in, because it's not just about a religion or about a belief in something else. It's about the purpose, the identity, and the love that God has for you because you were created in his image. I think that the church itself, and like you said, when I say church, I have to be careful how I say it, because do I truly mean the bride of Christ, those who say God, I want to obey your word because I love you and I'll do what you say, even though it's difficult, or those who just call themselves Christians in name only, because in honesty, it's easier to do in our country to be a Christian in name only. And just because it's something to do, I think that's declining, but it's still a reality. And we have to be careful with our own apathy and our own um, attitudes towards those who are also apathetic just towards belief in God. And so I wanted to say, why, or ask, why is apathy itself on either side dangerous?
Mm, yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say, uh, sometimes people are frustrating, people that believe really bad ideas.
Sure.
There's a young person in my life right now who I have very little, like I notice in my life, I'm like, I don't want to be around this person right now,
Yeah.
right? And I think that admitting that and repenting and saying, God, give me a heart for this person like you have is is huge. But then to get to the apathy question, I think it's so dangerous because Jesus didn't have that for us, right?
Yeah.
He came on a rescue mission for us and he invites us to be part of that. The other day I was reading in Isaiah 61, where it talks about the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to, actually, I have it right here. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. And it goes on to say, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion and bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord for the day of his splendor. Jesus quoted some of that in the synagogue. He left out the part about the vengeance. That's Jesus came to do all of that. And we get to be part of what he started here. He
Yeah.
didn't come, to just say, hey, I'm a good idea and leave, right?
Right.
He came on a rescue mission for us to seek and save the lost, to give his life as a ransom for many. And he invites us into that. And the life of a Christian is a life of laying down your life to follow after the things of Jesus. Just like back to that analogy of those men entering that school, to run in and go, I want to be part of whatever he's doing. There's this song that I love from The Greatest Showman, A Million Dreams. And there's a cover of it by a little girl named Claire Crosby. She was 5 years old. She was singing it with her dad. If you listen to the lyrics, some of it are theologically not great. But what I love about that song is it's a little girl saying, whatever you're doing, I want to be part of it. A million dreams of the world we're going to make. And I would say a million dreams of the world he's going to make, and we get to be part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not apathy. And frankly, if we're apathetic, why would we expect anyone else to want what we have?
Sure.
The world is looking for something authentic and real. And my podcast is called Finding Something Real. Real is an acronym for restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love.
Mm.
If we really have that in Jesus in a way that the world cannot have, then there is no apathy in that. That is full on like, hey, every day, Jesus, here's my hands, here's my feet, here's my mouth. Would you use it for your glory? Give me eyes to see those around me and run in the direction of those who are hurting that need to hear it. And not that we can save anybody, but he can. And
Right.
we trust someone who's got us.
Right.
So I hope that answers your question
No,
about the
that's
apathy
great.
part.
That's great.
Yeah.
Actually, I was thinking today, I was spending some time with the Lord, and I was thinking about the, the feeding of the 5,000, and when the disciples are like, how are we going to do this? Like, how are we going to feed it? And you think like the disciples would have got it eventually. Like, you're with the Son of God. I mean, he's walking on water here, guys. Come on. You know what I mean? But you can't knock them because I can see myself in them. And so, but you have this little boy who has these 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the disciple says, but what is this among so many? And I think we have to remember that it's that balance of knowing I don't have all that is required. I don't have all that it takes. I don't even have enough, but I know who does. I'm going to take what I have to the Lord and say, God, I'm going to speak the things that I know that are true. I may not know all that there is to know, but I know enough to speak the truth. And I'm going to share the knowledge that I have. I may not have all the knowledge of other people in this realm, like in apologetics, or have this doctorate from a seminary or whatever, but I have enough knowledge to know that you are God and I can show people who you are. So
Mhm.
take my loaves and fish, because I know what you can do with those things. You
Yeah.
can take them and you can feed the 5,000. Whatever I have isn't sufficient enough for me to do it, but it's sufficient enough for you. And
Yeah.
I even had a conversation with someone today talking about, I posted a clip of why I don't understand why these Christians with bigger platforms don't speak
Mm.
on the issues of truth if it
Mhm.
violates the word of God. And a lot of people have opinions, and they're saying, like, I think they're afraid of losing a following. And someone had messaged me and said, I feel like I do more harm than good when I try to speak. And I said, if you know the truth, speaking the truth in a loving way is all you need. And I feel like maybe that's why some seem apathetic. And so they
Mm.
bow out of the fight saying, I'm not equipped, I'm not trained. And I think your analogy of those officers going into that school is fantastic, because they were ready for the moment. And we are in a spiritual battle, and Christians need to be ready for the moment. And the moment is when you have someone who comes and asks a question. And what if you don't know the answer to that question? People always think I got to know the answer. And so if I don't think I know the answer, I'm just not even going to get on the conversation. But saying, let's find this out together, is a very good answer. Is to say,
Mhm.
I don't know if I can articulate that well enough, but I can sure find out, and we can talk about this together. But what is your perspective on this? Because obviously on the podcast, it's a little bit different setting, and you want to make sure that you do have people equipped enough to have these conversations, because
Mhm.
you're in a moment, right? You're in
Right.
a different kind of a moment. And what we don't want to do is let the moment pass us by in the real life situations, because that's an opportunity that we're allowing to pass by. But when you're preparing for this, how important do you see knowing what you're talking about is, but also saying, what do you do if you don't feel equipped enough? Because, like, do you understand what I'm asking? Like,
I
we
hope so.
still got to, I know, huh? Yeah, Shanda, get it together. No,
No, no.
we still have to have, as Christians, I think, I'm kind of all over the place here because my mind is going as I'm talking. But if you're apathetic and you find that you're confronted with a question and you're like, I don't know the answer, apathy will make you walk away and never even go look it up,
Mhm.
never go search it out, right? At
Yeah.
least in those moments, you should be like, oh my gosh, did I just let a soul walk past me and not have not be prepared enough? I have got to figure this out, because I will never let that happen again. I am
Mhm.
going to make sure I know. That would be the difference of learning from a moment to go deeper and not be apathetic, rather than, I feel like, just being completely apathetic and continuing down that path of apathy and saying, yeah, I don't know, so I'll leave it up to the experts.
Yeah. I think there's fear there, right?
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think when we're as Christians apathetic, or it comes across as apathetic, sometimes it's fear I'm not going to do it right. It's fear that I'm not going to do it as well as this person or that person, or what if they reject me? Which I think sometimes as Christians we jump too quickly to judging other Christians who we see doing it differently. It was interesting this morning. My husband and I, we were reading in Matthew, and it was talking about John the Baptist and about what happened when he was arrested and, his head's on the platter. And it was because he was speaking out in truth
Mhm.
about something. What about Jesus?
Yeah.
Jesus was still doing stuff. It doesn't say whether he was out speaking about that issue,
Right.
but he was doing the perfect will of his Father. And so I think that really stuck
Mhm.
struck with me this morning, because I think sometimes we do more harm than good when we're thinking, oh, this person, why don't you do it like I do it?
Mhm.
When really God has called each one of us. And I think the confidence that we have needs to come from deep relationship with Him
Yeah.
and knowing who we are in relationship with Him. Because if we know we're doing the will of Him who sent us, then when other people come along, Christians or non-Christians, and say you should be doing it this way, hey, I'm doing this for my Father. I'm in his word. I'm surrounded by brothers and sisters in Christ who are speaking to me, you know, and I'm spending time in prayer with him. I think that our confidence needs to come from that, because people are going to do it differently. People are going to do, you know, I know when I first started my podcast, the way that I do it now, somebody that I love in my life, she came to me and she said, "Are you sure you want to do it that way? Are you sure you want to have the open-endedness of somebody like pouring these objections out about Christianity on your podcast?" And I was scared, to be honest, because I thought, what if I'm doing it wrong?
Right.
But here's what I know in walking with the Lord. When I take it to him and I give it to him and say, "God, I trust you with this. I'm giving it to you." I've prayed it out with him. I've talked to him. I'm reading scriptures that are convicting me. And I'm thinking, if I don't do this, I'm being disobedient. Like, I'm going to go forward in that.
Yeah.
And sometimes other people are going to come along our way and they're going to say things. And we're going to feel like, was that conviction or was that guilt? I don't know. And if it's guilt, a lot of times, at least apathy, like, oh, if I can't do it right, I'm not doing it at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, step forward in what God has called you. Each one of us is gifted differently. It doesn't mean we don't speak out in truth. I
Right.
think we need to do that. But there is a time and a place for each of those things. And I think too, you know, going back to the apathy thing, when we see young people apathetic, sometimes we can feel so disheartened and like, man, really? Really? I get like that. That is what happens to me doing this podcast. I just did a whole month for a girl. She didn't come to any, and she would call herself a Christian. And I'm thinking, do you know how much work this is? Like,
Mm-hmm.
in my mind, in my flesh, that's what I'm thinking. Do you know what I'm doing for you? And then I have to take that to the Lord. But the thing is, most people will not stay apathetic forever because we live in a world of fallenness, of
Mm-hmm.
people who have issues. We have we have death, we have suffering, we have things that come that just blindside us. And what are we going to come to, right? I talked to a gal from Germany a couple of years ago, and she's like, yeah, people say that, you know, Europeans are apathetic or whatever, but when they get a taste of the real Jesus, there's no more apathy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we have. We have Jesus, and we need to keep our eyes on him and keep sharing him with the world. So
That's awesome. It's very encouraging, and I love that we are kind of wrapping it up towards this. Um, your podcast it is a lot more. Let me say this. How do I want to say it? It's very thoughtful and very mission minded. Whereas I wouldn't necessarily, I would say mine is thoughtful. I put thought into it because I can kind of picture my audience, but yours is much more mission minded than I mine is, in all honesty. And I think that
and
that's
that's totally great.
yeah, and I think that that's a great thing that you're doing. That's a task. And I don't want people to take it lightly because podcasting in itself is a lot of work. You know, just to find the right guests is a lot of work. Just to script your own solo episodes is a lot of work. But to find that girl that you can say, this is my mission field today, this month. And to me, that is such mission minded work. And I just think, Janelle, that I just want to say that's great work that you're doing. Like, it's, it's not to be taken lightly. And I pray blessings upon your ministry that God has given you, because again, you can meet people and you can know a little bit about them, but when you get into digging and seeing where their heart is, like, I love that your passion shines through. And I want you to just, as we get ready to wrap this up, let us know, one, where we can find you, any social media handles. I follow you on Instagram, and every once in a while you might do a little dance or something cute.
One time.
And we laugh about it.
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to reach Gen Z.
Yes.
Yeah, people can find me at findingsomethingreal.com or janellwood.com. They take you to the same place on Instagram, Janell_M_Wood, or just type in Finding Something Real. Yeah, it's pretty
Yeah.
easy.
Well, I'll definitely put all of that in the show notes. You and I are connected. We're on our cross-examined CIA Instructors Academy. I guess that's a mouthful. I don't know. What is it? On Facebook and stuff. So we get to see our updates and what's happening in each other's lives. We get to cheer each other on. And so this is special that you got to be on the podcast today. So I just
Mm,
loved, love the conversation. I mean, I think we talk about, oh, here's a few questions, but natural conversation will flow, and it definitely just evolves
yeah.
from there. You know, that's how easy
Well,
it is to talk to you.
I love what you're doing. And in fact, the other day, I was talking about apologetics with my kids, and my mom, she's looking up stuff, and she found your stuff with Frank Turek and the curriculum that you've put together. And it was so funny. She's just talking to me about it. And I said, that is my friend. That is my friend that I met.
You're like,
So anyway, it was so sweet.
you're like, Mom, and her name's Shanda. It rhymes with panda.
Yeah.
It's not Shonda, because everybody will be like, oh, look, it's Shonda Fulbright. All right.
Oh,
Whatever.
you know what? Anyway, I'll share something after we end here. But
Okay. Well, I'll have all the links in the show notes. If you guys have any questions for Janell, I mean, I'm going to, like I said, you're going to have all of her contact information in the show notes. You can go ahead and get in touch with her. Please listen to her podcast. It's amazing. And her work is, as you heard, is awesome work. Pray for her, pray for her ministry.
Mm.
We all need prayer, and don't be discouraged if you feel like I don't know enough, I don't have enough. If you know who Christ is and you believe in Jesus and you're in his word and you're clinging to that close relationship with him, you have enough to impact the next generation. And just remember, ask yourself, am I apathetic? Am I just going through my life, going through the motions, or am I on fire for God and telling people about him? And is that am I mission minded in that way? And if you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com, and I'll catch you on the next one.